Welcome to the CEC Report for June the 13th. I'm Elisa Barwick and with me is Robert Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Elisa.
In today's show, time for ratings agencies to pay the piper and Hungry Joe's whoppers must end. Bail-in an open secret. Now firstly, as we've spoken about many times, during the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, in Australia, over 300 councils, churches, charities and hospitals lost literally billions of dollars because they had invested in complex derivatives which they only trusted because they'd been given the coveted AAA rating by ratings agencies like Standard & Poor's.
And in the old British system, we used to call that gilt-edged, right?
Yeah. Now in 2012, 12 Australian local councils successfully sued Standard & Poor's for almost $20 million they had lost. However, that decision was appealed by Standard & Poor's and by the Dutch bank which created the derivatives, ABN AMRO. Now, last Friday, however, June the 6th, that appeal was rejected by the Federal Court, and the court found that S&P had acted in a misleading and deceptive manner.
Knowingly deceptive was their term.
Okay.
Knowingly deceptive.
And part of that deception was the fact that Standard & Poor's were actually paid by ABN AMRO to give them such a good rating so that they could get away with flogging this product off.
Yep.
Very dodgy product to these councils and literally loot them of billions of dollars. So what would be the implications of this decision?
Well, Australia is the only jurisdiction in the world that has actually found the ratings agencies liable in this situation. And they're not happy because they say, oh, this is just an opinion. The investor should know it's just an opinion. We don't have a relationship with the investor, so we should not be held liable for this. But as we've mentioned here before, as a point of ridicule, Elisa, government's credit ratings rise and fall on these ratings agencies, right? If the Queensland government, for example, has just told the people of Queensland we've got to privatise everything and slash the budget to the bone, so that we can get back our AAA rating.
And they lost a lot of money too.
Exactly.
In the same scandal.
So if I think the $30 million they lost, if they can get, based on the rating is your interest rate, right? And so the defence of Standard & Poor's was quite pathetic. So anyway, this is, for whatever reason, this is a jurisdiction in Australia which has upheld this. I suspect it's because what happened with the councils was so blatant, right? And some councils, to their credit, have fought back. But now there's a court ruling that they become precedents, not just inside a country, but around the world. And so the ratings agencies globally are very nervous that they can start being sued for hundreds of billions of dollars for the losses because they classified all these CDOs from the subprime crisis as AAA, right? So this could be enormous for them. And what's going to be less important is if they're bankrupted. And more important, if the powers that be realise, well, this system where these fraudsters are given the power of being the umpires of the system has to change.
Yeah, and even though there hasn't been any other actions outside of Australia, I think there is, a good basis to expect that this would be successful following what Australia.
Oh, there's actions outside of Australia. Even the US government is suing Standard & Poor's,
right? But
they haven't been concluded yet. So when those cases are heard in America and in Europe, etc., they will now take these Australian court decisions into account. So it was originally a federal court individual judge's decision. This was the full bench of the federal court upheld that original decision, and that will be noticed by these court cases overseas.
Okay, well, one other thing that did happen in the United States, following the GFC, there was an investigation which was a government-appointed commission that looked into the causes of that GFC, and it became known as the Angelides Commission by the head of the commission. And that reported in January 2011 on the role of the ratings agencies in the crisis. And I'll just quote from that commission's report. It said, "We conclude the failures of credit rating agencies were essential cogs in the wheel of financial destruction. The three credit rating agencies were key enablers of the financial meltdown. The mortgage-related securities at the heart of the crisis could not have been marketed and sold without their seal of approval. Investors relied on them, often blindly. In some cases, they were obligated to use them, or regulatory capital standards were hinged on them. This crisis could not have happened without the ratings agencies. Their ratings helped the market soar, and their downgrades throughout 2007-08 wreaked havoc across markets and firms.
And Elisa, I just want to, the line where it said, in some cases they were obligated to use them or regulatory capital standards were hinged on them. What that means is funds like those managed by councils, municipal funds that were lost here, or even say insurance funds. If you buy insurance, you want to know, you want to know that insurance company can back up that insurance. So there's laws governing what insurance funds can put their money in, and they're by law told you've got to put your money in AAA products, right? So they were when they're offered this AAA investment for a good return, but it's AAA, then that's where the obligation came in. And we've had councils tell us that when they were a bit suspicious that this was a AAA investment offered to them 2% higher than your average AAA, the higher ups in the local government, state government bureaucracies made them feel irresponsible if they didn't go in that direction.
And just, can you talk a bit about the detail of the types of instruments that these councils were actually investing in?
Well, yeah, we're going to talk about CPDOs, right? And it sounds like a droid out of Star Wars, right? Except CP3O was a goodie. If this was a droid in Star Wars, it'd be from the Death Star, sent out to kill everybody. So these mean constant proportion debt obligations, and this is the derivative that this court case was about. And the particular court case was about ABN AMRO and this derivative. A lot of the other losses that Australian councils suffered were from products sold to them by Lehman Brothers, which were the almost standard form of derivative called a CDO, collateralised debt obligation, which are still complicated, but they had nothing in terms of being complicated on these things. So constant proportion debt obligations are derivative bets on indices on other derivatives which are based on debts. So, and let me just briefly explain. The biggest and worst derivative that was at the core of the GFC meltdown in 2008 were these things called credit default swaps, because when the banks in America issued these subprime loans, they were crap loans. They knew that they were going to be defaulted on, right? But to pretend they were AAA, part of the pretense was to say, oh, we've insured them. How did they insure them? Well, they didn't go to, a standard insurance company insure, and they insure them through the financial system by buying what were called credit default swaps, so that there was a payout to them if the bad loan was defaulted on, right? And they bought them through, one of the biggest players in credit default swaps was AIG, right? So these credit default swaps provided the kind of insurance, but of course they were derivatives on the bad debts of subprime mortgages. When all the debts defaulted, they were proved to be worthless, the credit default swaps were proved to be worthless, and the whole thing melted down. Well, what CPDOs are is ABN AMRO started what they called a special purpose vehicle, where they went around to investors saying, invest your money with us, i.e. lend us money in the form of an investment, we'll give you 2% more than the AAA rate. And they took that money and they made bets with it on not credit default swaps, but on indices of credit default swaps. So you'd have an index that would measure the performance of credit default swaps across a range of companies. So they would make bets on that index, and that index was based on the debt of that company. And they had a company doing this with managers in it, and they were obligated to manage this every day. Like this had to be closely monitored. They had to adjust their bets to fine-tune them to the market fluctuations, right? So that they could meet this return that they'd promised the investors, right? But because it was like, so many layers of derivatives that these things were based on, when Standard & Poor's gave that a AAA, to me, there's no clearer case that this is not, bad decision making by Standard & Poor's, etc. This is outright fraud. This is criminal fraud. There should be no. This is so bizarre. The London Financial Times describes CPDOs as a seriously complex financial instrument invented by ABN AMRO and designed to pay the same high interest rate as a risky junk bond while offering the highest possible credit rating, right? And it was that, no one would have even looked twice at such a ridiculous derivative if it didn't have a AAA rating on it.
That's right. Now, there's obviously some people in the higher echelons of local government who don't think that this kind of crisis could happen again. However, when we come back, we're going to discuss how it no doubt will happen again and on a much worse scale. So we'll talk about bail-in and how funds throughout all bank accounts of councils and other bodies could be completely wiped out in one fell swoop.
Yep.
Welcome back. Hungry Joe's whoppers must end. Bail-in, an open secret. So we finally caught Joe Hockey out in the lie which we've long been exposing. Yeah,
well, Lisa, bail-in, which regular viewers of this program will know and people who read our literature, is what happened in Cyprus last March 2013, right? That when the bank got in trouble, to keep the banks going so that that bank crisis didn't spread to the rest of Europe, they had to keep these failing banks going. They just said to the people who had deposits in the bank, okay, you guys are getting a deposit haircut. You're going to lose a certain amount of money so that the liability of the bank can be reduced and it can be pretend to be solvent again, right? Anyway, so, and then we know, and we're going to go through the chronology of evidence in a little while, but we know that this is planned for Australia, and we've been saying that people have taken our warnings seriously, and a lot of constituents have gone to their members of parliament to ask them what's going on here, and those MPs have followed this up with Joe Hockey. And can I just say, it's kind of coincides. One of the reasons people have become more suspicious is because Australia already is actively pursuing a different type of bail-in by stealth. It shouldn't be called bail-in, but it is deposit stealing, and that's what it proved to be. When the Rudd government reduced the length of time that they regarded a bank account as dormant from, it used to be 7 years. For decades it was 7 years. If a bank account hadn't been touched for 7 years, the government would take it. Rudd reduced it to 3 years. It turns out they've taken more money, the feds have taken more money in the last year under that policy, $360 million, than was taken in the 5 previous decades.
And they didn't exactly have a big campaign to let people know that this was happening.
And these aren't dormant accounts. This is money people have put away for a rainy day, right? Thinking they're doing the right thing. They're discouraged from putting it under the bed. So anyway, what people realise is, hang on, the government don't really respect our rights to our own deposits, right? So this has made them even more worried. Members of Parliament have fronted up Joe Hockey's office and said, is it true? And for 12 months now, even before Hockey was the Treasurer, he has led the charge to say, no, there are no plans for bail-in Australia, right? No, not, and we've got it all in letters from umpteen MPs, these letters have been forwarded to us. So anyway, as we said last week, we now know that back in April, Hockey chaired the latest meeting of the G20 finance ministers, where the man in charge of bail-in for the world, Mark Carney, handed down reports to say, hey boys, bail-in is on track for the Brisbane G20 conference.
And Hockey handed down those reports in
a media
his job
as the chairman.
Conference. Yep. Exactly.
So he knows what's in the reports.
Exactly, yeah. Now I wanted to add to that there's 2 other figures who've been talking about bail-in in the last week or 2, which are Glenn Stevens, our Reserve Bank Governor, and Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase. Now, Glenn Stevens made a speech to a 10th June symposium on Asian banking and finance in San Francisco.
Before you quote this speech, apologies to the viewers, this is what you call central banker speak, and I think he copies Alan Greenspan and how he expresses himself.
So this is what he said about the effort and he actually said Australia's highly supportive of Mark Carney's efforts to resolve too big to fail through the use of bail-in. So he said, such too big to fail entities are sufficiently large and interconnected that an uncontrolled failure could easily cause systemic disruption.
Which means if one goes down, it could melt down the whole system.
Therefore, he said, it is argued that further loss-absorbing capacity is needed to be called on at the point of non-viability,
i.e. bankruptcy,
so as to allow vital functions to continue and non-critical operations to be wound down in a controlled way. This limits adverse spillovers to the system and the economy. Generally, this loss-absorbing capacity is to come from a, quote, bail-in of certain classes of private creditors.
And what that means, we know unsecured creditors, which is the rather bland description for all the liabilities owed to people that include depositors.
Mm-hmm. So as to avoid calling on the public purse for a bailout. This is an appealing idea, he said, though it comes with the caveat that to my knowledge it has not successfully been done for a major institution to date. Now, Jamie Dimon said a similar thing, although much of the media and people have interpreted it in a different way, because he said big banks should be allowed to fail without taxpayers bearing losses. So people have said, oh, he said let the banks crash. But that is not strictly what he means. He's meaning restricting the bailout to those who are creditors in that particular institution so that banks can go bust without causing a risk to the entire system.
Well, our argument, Elisa, is depositors are taxpayers too. The idea, what they're saying is, okay, here's a bank that's too big to fail. If a bank's too big to fail and it does fail, it'll bring down the whole system. So we can't let it fail. But we don't want to put up taxpayer money anymore to bail it out. So what we'll do is we will create a law where if that bank gets into trouble, it has to steal its own depositors' money to keep itself going. Our argument is, well, that doesn't change the fact that that bank is too big to fail. So Jamie Dimon, Glenn Stevens, they always say, oh, this is a problem, this solves too big to fail. No, it doesn't. The only thing that solves too big to fail is Glass-Steagall, which takes those banks and splits them up so they are now small banks and not too big to fail.
And
right?
not risking depositors' money, which is not there at their own risk.
That's right.
By gambling.
Take the deposits away in a separate institution which is not allowed to do anything risky. That's how you protect deposits.
Now, Jamie Dimon said these things in an interview on the 4th June with the Australian Financial Review, and that article also said that the Financial System Inquiry is finalising an interim report now which will address the question of too big to fail in the context of moral hazard. So, and this is the way they always refer to bail-in. So no doubt this will advocate bail-in, given that our Treasurer and the head of our Reserve Bank are both on the same page on this.
Yeah, and we know that the man in charge of the Financial System Inquiry, the David Murray, the former head of the Commonwealth Bank, he has already been on the record as opposed to Glass-Steagall. So he's handing down, we know the guy who gave him the job, Joe Hockey, is in charge of the G20, which is in charge of preparing bail-in. So I suspect we're going to find next month when this is handed down that this will be the imprimatur. Okay, bail-in is underway for Australia.
Now we're going to stop, but when we come back we're going to go through a bit of a rundown of the history of the progress of bail-in. Welcome back. Now we've just been talking about the agenda to get bail-in through both in Australia and globally by the time of the G20 Leaders Summit in November. Now we wanted to give a bit of a history of the push for bail-in here in Australia and globally, particularly for people who haven't followed this, as a refresher also for those who have. Now obviously after the GFC there was an immediate push for this, but in 2009 was the G20 summit in London, which Kevin Rudd represented Australia at, and he, together with the other leaders of the G20 countries, all signed on to the demand to create, or actually they created at that point, the
Financial Stability
Board. And that the purpose of that was to put the stability of the entire global financial system ahead of any individual nation or banks within that nation.
Now that's the point. That's very key. Stability. They cite that as their justification for all this. Oh, we don't want to go through another meltdown, therefore stability comes first, therefore governments and individuals have to give way to the stability of the system. And what that actually meant, Elisa, was these derivatives, which are the greatest cause of instability, we're not going to let them melt down anymore. We're going to prop them up, right? Instead of, they should have cancelled them, but we're going to prop them up and therefore through bail-in.
It's also giving power across the entire global system to this unelected body, the Financial Stability Board, run out of the Bank for International Settlements. Now in 2011 came the G20 summit in Cannes, France, where all G20 nations agreed to implement the FSB report, which was written in October 2011, which was called the Key Attributes of Effective Resolution Regimes for Financial Institutions. That was a crucial thing which we've referred to. In September 2012, the same Financial Stability Board wrote a peer review of Australia where it admitted that the government's guarantee of bank deposits would not work, because this is the defence a lot of people had put up. There won't be a bail-in because we've got our deposits protected.
Since 2008, people think, oh, well, our deposits are protected here. And they just pointed out, listen, there's only $20 billion provision to protect deposits in every bank in Australia, and that will not work with the 80% of deposits that are in the big four banks, because there's $1 trillion of deposits there virtually.
So they stated that figure, and they said in any event there could be circumstances in which these banks would be deemed too big to undergo payout and liquidation. Then in March 2013 came the Cyprus bail-in. So this was the first time this kind of effort was used. And
Elisa, there's an argument that this was a miscalculation on their part. They'd been preparing bail-in for a long time. There was a worry that the Cyprus bank's meltdown Europe was very vulnerable and would trigger contagion across Europe. So they whacked it in place in Cyprus. And what it did is it revealed to the whole world for the first time what actually they meant by bail-in. And when the world saw it, everyone said, uh-oh, no, we don't want that.
No longer theoretical. Now, April 15, 2013, the Financial Stability Report said that there is legislation for bail-in in train in Australia. Then came the caution. July 30, 2013, the head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, sent a secret letter to the EU Commission saying, be quiet about bail-in until the banking union in Europe is fully implemented, because this could set off runs on the banks.
And that's been implemented as of this year.
Yes. And then August 31st, 2013, the head of the Financial Security Board, Mark Carney, praised Australia's progress towards bail-in in the lead up to the Russian G20 and demanded all countries fully implement it. Then in September 2013, at that St. Petersburg G20 meeting, the declaration from the Leaders' Summit stated that all major jurisdictions in part or in full have implemented tools for too-big-to-fail bank resolution without taxpayer losses. October 15th, 2013, the IMF Fiscal Monitor suggested a capital levy of 10% on private wealth Europe-wide.
Oh, you're just grabbing 10% out of everyone's accounts across the board?
Then in October 24th, 2013 was when Mark Carney said that bail-in must be implemented across all G20 jurisdictions by the Brisbane G20 Summit November this year. And then, as you mentioned, December 11th, 2013, the EU Parliament okayed the single resolution mechanism for a European-wide banking union, which brings us back to these latest developments with hockey and this recent, the G20 coming up.
Yep, and Elisa, I was in a meeting in Canberra in March where someone high up in the Treasury admitted to me face-to-face that bail-in legislation is being drafted in Australia. He tried to downplay it as just a certain type of bail-in legislation, but it was actually direct confirmation. Now,
of course, the real point is banks in which we keep our savings must not be allowed to gamble in the first place, and then they won't need to be bailed out in such a way. We need to fight for Glass-Steagall. You can get a hold of a free copy of our Glass-Steagall magazine by contacting us on the number on the screen. Also, the Australian Alert Service is available, which has recorded the progress towards bail-in throughout this entire period, where no one else has.
Yeah, we've been reporting this in detail in the Alert Service. So if you want to follow this up, get yourself the Alert Service.
And I would also recommend joining our email list, which you can do on our website, so that you get regular weekly updates once or twice a week on this. Now, thanks for tuning into the CEC Report, and join us again next week.